Victor Langford didn't knock. He never knocked. He pushed open the door to Wyatt Mercer's ranch like he already owned it, because, in his mind, he already did. He dropped a folded paper on the table without a word. A legal notice. Wyatt's name was on it, but the land described wasn't quite his anymore, at least not according to a survey no one had ever seen before that morning. "Sign it," Victor said, "or lose everything the slow way." Wyatt stared at the paper. His hands didn't shake, but something behind his eyes did. And standing in the doorway, still dusty from 3 days on a stagecoach, was a woman he'd never met. A woman who had come to be his wife. A stranger. She looked at the paper. Then she looked at Victor. And she said quietly, "That survey is fraudulent, and I can prove it." If you've ever watched someone walk into the worst moment of your life and refuse to flinch, then you already know what happened next. Stay with us, because this story is just getting started. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. Hit that button and ring the bell so you don't miss a single chapter of this story. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. The morning Wyatt Mercer drove his wagon into Harlow Creek to collect his mail-order bride, he told himself 3 things. He told himself he was not nervous. He told himself this was a business arrangement, nothing more. The same as buying a new fence post or hiring a hand for spring branding. And he told himself that whatever she looked like, whatever she sounded like, it made no difference to him at all. He had spent 7 years building that particular wall, and he was reasonably proud of how solid it had become. By noon, 2 of those 3 things would be ash. Harlow Creek was not a large town. It had a general store, a livery, a post office that doubled as a telegraph office on busy days, a saloon that never officially closed, and about 240 people who had absolutely nothing better to do than watch the widower Mercer wait for the 11 o'clock stage. Wyatt understood this. He had factored it into his morning and decided he didn't care. He parked the wagon at the far end of the main street, crossed his arms over the seat rail, and watched the road south like a man waiting for livestock at auction. He did not look at the crowd that was definitely not gathering near the feed store. He did not acknowledge Chester Pruitt, who was clearly watching from beneath the porch awning with a cup of coffee he had no intention of drinking. He did not make eye contact with Nadine Hollis, who ran the seamstress shop and who had strong opinions about everything and the lung capacity to share them all at once. Wyatt Mercer was 51 years old, 6 feet and 1 inch of weathered Montana rancher, and he did not require an audience for the private moments of his life. The fact that Harlow Creek apparently disagreed was not his problem. The stage was 12 minutes late. He counted. The thing about waiting was that it gave a man time to think, and thinking was not always Wyatt's friend. He thought about the letter he had sent to the correspondence agency 6 months ago. The careful, deliberate, almost cold letter he had written at the kitchen table after 3 failed attempts to word it differently. He had been specific. He had asked for a woman of practical temperament, someone comfortable with hard work and silence. Someone who understood that a working cattle ranch in the upper Yellowstone Valley was not a romantic destination, but a living that required constant maintenance and offered exactly nothing in the way of comfort or softness. He had said, clearly, that he did not wish to see a photograph. The woman at the agency, he had dealt only by letter, had apparently found this unusual. She had written back asking if he was certain. He had written back saying yes, he was certain, and please proceed. He knew what photographs did. He knew how a face could get inside a person before the rest of them arrived. He had learned that lesson once, and the learning of it had cost him everything, and he was not interested in a refresher course. So he had no idea what to expect when the stagecoach finally rounded the southern bend, trailing a cloud of summer dust, and rattled to a stop in front of the post office. Chester Pruitt set down his coffee cup. Nadine Hollis stopped pretending to look at something else. Even the horses seemed to pay attention. 3 passengers stepped out, a heavy-set man in a traveling coat who turned immediately toward the saloon without looking at anyone, an older woman with a hat box who was met by what appeared to be her son, and then, last, a woman who paused on the step of the coach for just a moment, not dramatically, not performing anything, just taking a breath and looking at the street the way a person does when they arrive somewhere new and are quietly deciding what to make of it. She was not what Wyatt had expected. He couldn't have told you what he had expected exactly, but it wasn't this. She was perhaps 40, give or take, He wasn't good with ages anymore. Dark hair pulled back practically under a plain hat. A traveling dress that had seen better days and didn't seem to bother her about it. She was not a small woman, not fragile, not the kind of person the word delicate would ever attach itself to. She had the posture of someone who had made decisions under pressure and gotten most of them right. She looked at the street, she looked at the wagon, she looked at Wyatt, and then she picked up her bag, one bag, not the trunk he had halfway assumed, and walked toward him. No hesitation, no nervous glancing around, no waiting to be collected like a piece of freight. She just walked over. Wyatt climbed down from the wagon because it would have been rude not to, and he was not a rude man, whatever else he was. "Mr. Mercer," she said. It wasn't a question. She'd apparently made him out from 20 yards away, which meant he was more readable than he liked to think. "Miss Hale," he said. They looked at each other for a moment. "One bag," he said, because he needed to say something. "One bag," she agreed. "The wagon's this way." "I can see that." He took the bag from her. She let him, without making a production of either accepting or resisting. And they walked to the wagon without speaking. He was aware, in a way he found irritating, that the entire population of Harlow Creek was watching this walk. He was also aware, in a way he found more irritating, that Evelyn Hale did not appear to notice or care. She walked at a steady pace beside him and looked at the buildings they passed the way a person reads a map, gathering information, filing it away. When they reached the wagon, he put her bag in the back and went around to his side. She climbed up to the seat without waiting for help, which he noted and then tried not to think about. "How far is the ranch?" she asked as he took up the reins. "Hour and a half, maybe a little more. Road gets rough past the creek crossing." "All right." He clicked to the horses and they moved. For perhaps 5 minutes, neither of them spoke. This was fine with Wyatt. Silence was not his enemy. He had lived in a great deal of it and had made a kind of peace with the arrangement. Then Evelyn said, "Your letter was honest." He glanced at her. "Meaning what?" "Meaning most men who write to correspondence agencies describe themselves as hardworking and decent," she said, "and then turn out to be something else entirely. You described yourself as difficult." "I said practical," Wyatt said. "You said practical 3 times and difficult once. You thought the difficult was buried well enough that I wouldn't notice it." He looked at the road. "And you came anyway." "I came because," she said, "difficult men who know they're difficult are easier to work with than pleasant men who don't." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Is that how you're approaching this? Work?" She turned and looked at him directly. The kind of look that did not blink away when you looked back. "Is that not how you described it in your letter?" He had. He absolutely had. He'd used the phrase working arrangement no fewer than 4 times and had been privately proud of its precision. "Fair point," he said. She went back to watching the road ahead. The thing was, and Wyatt recognized this even as it was happening, which made it worse, the thing was that she was not performing anything. She was not nervous and pretending not to be. She was not trying to make a good impression. She was simply present in the way that very few people were actually present, and it made the inside of the wagon feel smaller than it had an hour ago. He did not know what to do with that. So he drove. Well, the ranch was called the Crossbar because the original homestead marker had been 2 crossed iron bars that Wyatt's father had driven into the ground 40 years ago, and which were still there, rusted into the earth at the base of the front fence post. Wyatt had considered the name impractical. He'd considered a lot of things his father had done impractical, but he hadn't changed it. Some things you didn't change. The ranch had seen better decades. He knew that. He'd been seeing it slowly for 3 years, watching the back pasture fence sag in 2 places, watching the barn roof go from concerning to genuinely worrying, watching the kitchen garden his wife Clara had planted go to weeds the summer after she died and not recovering since. He'd kept the cattle numbers up. He'd kept the books in the black, barely. He'd kept the house standing. That was what surviving looked like. He'd learned to call it good enough. Evelyn stepped down from the wagon and stood in front of the house for a moment. He waited for her to say something about the condition of the porch rail, which had been meaning to be fixed since winter, or the kitchen garden that looked like something had given up in it. But she didn't. She said, "Where do you want me to put my things?" "I'll show you," he said. The room he had prepared was the small one off the back hallway, the one that had been his son's room, which he had emptied out 4 years ago and then not used for anything because he couldn't decide what it should be now. He had put a bed in it last week, and fresh linens, and a small chest, and a mirror, and it was functional, and he was not going to think about what it had been before. He pushed open the door and stepped back. Evelyn looked at the room. She looked at it for about 3 seconds, then looked at him. "Thank you," she said. "This is fine." "Supper's at 6, he said. "I cook Monday through Friday. We can work out the rest of it." "I'll take Saturday and Sunday," she said immediately. "You don't know what I make." "No," she said, "but I know how to cook for a working ranch, which you presumably don't need to be told means something more substantial than a city supper. So if you're open to it, I'll take weekends." He stared at her for a moment. "All right," he said. He went back outside to unharness the horses. He stood in the barn for a while afterward, longer than necessary, with his hands on the stall post and his head down. He was not nervous. He reminded himself of this. But something in the foundation of the last 7 years had shifted, just slightly, and he could feel it the way you feel a crack in a floor before you can see it, with the bottom of your foot. He didn't know yet what it meant. He told himself it didn't mean anything. Matraki. The first 3 days were careful. Not cold. Evelyn was not a cold person. He had established that quickly. But careful, the way two people are when they are learning the geography of a shared space and trying not to make it complicated before they've figured out the basics. She was up before he was on the second morning, which surprised him. He came down to the kitchen at 5:15 to find the stove already going and coffee already made, and Evelyn standing at the kitchen window looking out at the east pasture with a cup in her hand. "Cattle were restless last night," she said without turning around. "Wind," he said. "Maybe," she said, "or one of your herd is off." The sound was uneven. He poured himself a cup of coffee and looked at her. "You know cattle?" "My uncle had a small spread in Kansas when I was young. Not like this, but enough to know the difference between wind restless and sick restless." He looked out the window at the pasture. The herd was quiet now in the early gray of morning. "I'll check the West group after breakfast," he said. "I'll come," she said. He started to say you don't need to, and then thought about how that sentence would land and didn't say it. "Fine," he said instead. She was right about the cattle. It was a heifer in the third grouping, a 3-year-old, one of his better animals, running a low fever and standing apart from the others with that particular flat look in her eyes that meant she wasn't eating right. Wyatt wouldn't have found it for another day or 2, maybe 3. By then it could have gone to the herd. He caught himself looking at Evelyn with an expression he didn't intend and turned away before she could see it. "I'll get the medicine from the barn," he said. When he came back, she was standing beside the heifer with one hand on the animal's neck, talking to it in a low, completely unsentimental voice. Not cooing, not babying it, just talking, the way you talk to something when you want it to stay calm and you're not sure it's going to. He administered the medication. The heifer's ear twitched. "She'll be all right," Evelyn said. "Probably," he agreed. They walked back to the house in silence. A different silence than the one on the wagon ride. Easier, somehow, like a room after the furniture's been moved to fit better. On the 4th morning, Wyatt came into the kitchen and found the supply ledger open on the table. Evelyn was sitting across from it with a pencil and what appeared to be a separate sheet of paper she had produced from somewhere, covered in her own notes. "I'm reorganizing the supply records," she said, before he could ask. "I have a system," he said. She looked up at him. "Your system is 17 months behind and has 2 entries for the same fence wire purchase in March." "I've been busy." "I understand that." She said it without accusation, which somehow made it harder to object to. "I'm not criticizing. I'm saying I can fix it, if you want it fixed. It'll take me a few days." Wyatt stood in the kitchen doorway looking at his open ledger. The honest answer was that the ledger had been bothering him since Christmas, and he hadn't done anything about it because sitting down and working through it meant sitting at the table for several hours, which meant being in the kitchen for several hours, which was where Clara had spent most of her time. And even now that was harder than it should have been, and he was not going to explain that to anyone. "Fine," he said, "if you want to." "I do," she said, and went back to her notes. He got his coffee and went outside, and he stood on the porch for a while with the cup getting cold in his hands, looking at nothing in particular, trying to identify the feeling that had settled in his chest. It took him a while to name it, and when he did, it disturbed him. It was relief. On the 6th day, Chester Pruitt came by. Chester was Wyatt's closest neighbor, closest being a relative term out here, meaning 4 miles instead of 12, and ostensibly came by to return a post-hole digger Wyatt had lent him in May. The post-hole digger was in the back of Chester's wagon. Chester, however, did not get it out. He sat on his seat and talked. Wyatt stood by the fence and let him. Chester was a decent man, a widower himself these past 9 years, and he had the particular quality of not being subtle about his curiosity, but being kind enough that you forgave him for it. "She seems like a solid woman," Chester said, looking toward the house where Evelyn was visible through the kitchen window doing something that involved a bowl and what appeared to be concentrated effort. "She's practical," Wyatt said. "She fixed your chicken coop." "She mentioned it needed fixing," Chester nodded thoughtfully. "You notice her eyes?" "Chester, I'm asking a reasonable question." "Get your post-hole digger out of the wagon," Wyatt said. Chester got down slowly. He had a bad knee and took his time about it, which Wyatt respected, and lifted the post-hole digger out of the back. He handed it over. "I'm just saying," Chester said, "that Nadine Hollis was at the store yesterday and she said that woman walked in and ordered supplies for your back fence repair and the medicine for your sick heifer both in the same trip, and she knew the prices and didn't accept being overcharged, and Nadine couldn't decide if she was impressed or put out." "Probably both," Wyatt said. "Probably both," Chester agreed. He looked at Wyatt with the expression of a man who had something to say and was deciding whether to say it. "She treating you all right?" Wyatt looked at the barn. "She's treating me better than I deserve, I think," he said, which was more honest than he intended, and he knew by Chester's face that it landed that way. Chester nodded once, retrieved his hat from the wagon seat, and climbed back up. "You let me know if you need anything," he said. "I will." "And Wyatt." He looked up. Chester settled his hat. "You don't have to keep apologizing to Clara for still being alive," he said quietly. "She wouldn't want that. She was too sensible for it." He drove off before Wyatt could answer. Wyatt stood by the fence for a long time after the sound of the wagon faded. It was on the 7th evening that Evelyn found the photographs. She hadn't been looking for anything. She had been putting a book back on the shelf in the sitting room. She had asked to borrow it. He had said yes. And the shelf was built into the wall beside the fireplace, and the photographs were on the mantel above it. She had seen them before, of course. She had simply not looked directly at them. She looked at them now. A woman with a wide, genuine smile, mid-30s perhaps, in the photograph, with the kind of face that suggested she laughed easily and meant it. A young boy, perhaps 7 or 8, sitting on a fence rail with his arms out for balance and an expression of terrified delight that suggested he had been dared to get up there and had decided the dare was worth it. Wyatt was in the doorway. He didn't know how long he'd been standing there. He had seen her looking and stopped. She turned. She saw him. She didn't say, "I'm sorry for your loss." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "He looks like you around the eyes." Wyatt's throat did something he was not going to acknowledge in front of her or anyone. "His name was Thomas," he said. "How old?" 9. The accident. He was 9. She nodded. She looked at the photograph of Clara. "She must have been remarkable," she said. "Not performing, just saying it straight and clear." "She was," he said. And then because something was coming loose in him that he hadn't accounted for. "She would have liked you, I think. She had no patience for nonsense either." Evelyn looked at him. "That's the best thing you've said to me," she said. He didn't know what to do with that. He went to the kitchen and made coffee that neither of them needed at 8 o'clock in the evening, and she followed and sat at the table, and they drank it in a silence that was not uncomfortable. And outside the Montana dark settled over the Crossbar Ranch, and the cattle were quiet, and the wind came through the pines on the east ridge, and it smelled, for the first time in a long time, like something that might be called a home. He was not going to say that, but he thought it, and that was worse than saying it in a way, because you couldn't take a thought back once you'd had it. It just sat there, solid and inconvenient, in the space where the wall used to be. And the wall, he was beginning to understand, was not as solid as it had seemed a week ago. He had no idea yet how much that was going to matter. Part 2. A woman who sees every hidden crack. The coffee had gone cold by the time either of them spoke again that night, but neither of them moved to reheat it. That was the thing about the crossbar after dark. The silence had weight to it, not the empty kind, but the kind that accumulated over years of a man living alone in rooms that used to be full of someone else's noise. Wyatt had gotten so used to that weight that he'd stopped noticing it. But sitting across the table from Evelyn, watching her turn her cup slowly in her hands without drinking from it, he noticed it now. It pressed down on everything. And she was just sitting in it, not trying to fill it up or push through it, just letting it be there the way you let weather be weather. He respected that more than he wanted to admit. "I should have fixed the back fence before you got here," he said finally. It was not what he meant to say. He wasn't sure what he meant to say. Evelyn looked up. "The back fence is fine for now. The water trough in the east pasture is the one that needs attention. There's a slow split in the seam. You're losing maybe 2 inches a day. By August, it'll be 6. He stared at her. "How do you know about the trough?" "I walked the east pasture this afternoon while you were in town." She said it without apology, which was interesting because most people he'd found apologized unnecessarily for being thorough. "I wasn't snooping. I wanted to understand the land." "And?" She was quiet for a moment, in the way that meant she was deciding how much to say, not whether to say it. He was learning to read the difference. "Your land is good," she said. "The grass is better than it looks from the road. Your herd is healthy. Mostly. Your fencing plan is logical, but it's 3 seasons behind. You've been prioritizing survival over maintenance." She paused. "That's not a criticism. That's just what it is." "Most people would call it a criticism," Wyatt said. "Most people haven't run a household on a budget that doesn't allow for fixing everything at once," she said. "You make choices. Some of the choices catch up with you eventually. That's ranching." He looked at her for a long moment. "You ran a household." It wasn't quite a question. She had mentioned her uncle's Kansas spread, but the way she talked about budgets and choices had a different quality to it. More personal, more specific. "My father died when I was 22, she said. "I ran his household in Columbus for 11 years after that. My mother, 2 younger brothers, and a sister. We weren't poor exactly, but the margin was thin enough that you could see through it if you held it to the light." She said this without drama, the way you describe whether you've already survived. "I learned to see where things were going before they arrived." "That why you came out here?" Wyatt asked. "After all that?" Something moved across her face. Not quite grief, not quite humor, somewhere in between. "After my sister married and my brothers were established, there wasn't much left to hold me in Columbus. And someone told me once that the frontier had a shortage of practical women." She looked at him levelly. Apparently that was true. Wyatt almost smiled. It surprised him enough that he covered it by picking up his cup and drinking the cold coffee. "Get some sleep," he said, standing. "I start early." "I know," she said. "I was up before you yesterday." He was almost to the hallway when she said, "Wyatt," he stopped. "The trough," she said. "If we patch it this week, before the heat sets in hard, it'll hold another 2 seasons. I've done that kind of repair before. I can show you the method if you haven't used it." He stood with his hand on the doorframe. "All right," he said, and went to bed, and lay there for a considerable time, looking at the ceiling and thinking about nothing in particular. Which was a lie, he told himself, because the nothing in particular had a very specific shape, and it was sitting at his kitchen table turning a cold coffee cup in its hands. The trough repair took them most of a Tuesday morning. Evelyn had found a method involving a heated pitch compound and a strip of shaped metal that Wyatt had not used before and was reluctantly impressed by. She did not explain it in the way of someone teaching. She just did it, and talked through what she was doing in the same way she'd talked to the sick heifer, low and direct and without performance. He handed her things when she needed them. They didn't talk much. The work went well. It was while they were cleaning up afterward, both of them sitting on the fence rail with their hands dirty and the morning burning off into a real July heat, that Wyatt saw the rider coming down the valley road. He knew the horse before he could make out the man. Black thoroughbred, too well bred for this country, too well groomed, the kind of animal that announced money before you could see the saddle. Evelyn was watching too. Who is that? Wyatt's jaw tightened in a way he didn't try to hide. Victor Langford. She looked at the rider, then at Wyatt. Something in her settled. Not tense exactly, but alert in the way a person gets alert when a conversation is about to require more than it appears to. What does he want? She asked. Usually? Everything that belongs to someone else. He straightened up off the rail. Stay back here if you want. Why would I do that? She said, and stepped off the rail beside him. Victor Langford was 55 and had made enough money in territorial land speculation to believe that his money was proof of his intelligence, which was the kind of mistake that was hard to correct in a man once it set in. He was handsome in this way of men who had once been athletic and now were merely large. With silver hair he wore slightly too long and a way of sitting a horse that was designed to look casual and instead looked studied. He reined in at the fence gate and looked down at Wyatt with the pleasant expression of a man who had never once needed to worry about whether the conversation would go his way. Mercer, he said. His eyes went to Evelyn for just a second. The kind of look that assessed and dismissed in the same motion. Heard your bride arrived. Congratulations. Langford, Wyatt said. What do you need? Victor smiled. It was a good smile. That was the trouble with him. All his weapons were good ones. Just neighborly visit. Wanted to ask how you're doing with the North Boundary question. I know Dutton came by in April about the survey discrepancy. There's no discrepancy, Wyatt said. Well, that's the thing, Victor said, reaching into his coat pocket with the ease of a man producing something he'd already won with. My surveyor found something a little different from the county record. Just a few yards, probably an old measurement error. I figured we'd settle it quietly rather than take it to the commission. He produced a folded paper and held it out. Wyatt did not move toward it. After a moment, Evelyn stepped forward and took the paper. Victor's smile flickered, barely, but Wyatt caught it. She unfolded it and read it. She read it carefully, turning to the second page, then back to the first. Her face showed nothing during this. Her face was very good at showing nothing when she wanted it to. The survey is dated March of this year, she said. That's right, Victor said pleasantly, and it contradicted the original territorial survey from 1871, which is the document of legal record. She refolded the paper along its original creases. Who signed this? A qualified surveyor, Victor said. Fellow named Dodd, out of Helena. I'm not familiar with a Dodd registered with the Territorial Surveyor's Office, she said, but I can check. Victor looked at her with the patient expression of a man recalibrating. And you would be? Evelyn Mercer, she said. Wyatt heard her say his name, his last name, and something went through him that he was not going to examine in the middle of a fence-line conversation with Victor Langford. Well, Mrs. Mercer, Victor said with a warmth that didn't reach his eyes, I don't think this requires any checking. It's a simple boundary clarification. Then you won't mind if we have the original survey pulled from the county record and compared, she said. If it's simple, it should match. If it doesn't match, it isn't simple. She held the paper back out to him. We'll need our own copy. You can provide one through the county clerk's office. The pleasant expression on Victor's face did not quite hold for the next 2 seconds. Something underneath it moved, and then the pleasantness came back, smooth as oil over water. Of course, he said. He took the paper. He looked at Wyatt. You've got a sharp one here, Mercer. I noticed, Wyatt said. Victor touched his hat brim and rode back down the valley road without hurrying, because he was the kind of man who left at his own pace, regardless of what had just happened to him. They watched him go. He's done this before, Evelyn said. Not a question. What makes you say that? He didn't argue, she said. He just smiled and left. That's a man who has other options already in place. He came here to get a read on you, not to close the deal. She was still watching the road. He wanted to see if you'd take the paper from him, if you'd engage with his terms before questioning them. Wyatt looked at her. You've dealt with men like him before, he said. She was quiet for a moment. My father was a clerk in the county records office, she said, before he died. 11 years is a long time to hear what men like that do when they think no one is paying attention. She folded her hands in front of her and turned away from the road. We need to get to the county clerk's office before he does. They went the next morning. Wyatt drove. Evelyn brought a small notebook she'd found somewhere and a pencil she kept behind her ear, which he had decided to simply accept as a feature of her existence. The county clerk's office was in Millbrook, 22 miles east, housed in a building that served as courthouse, assessor's office, and on particularly confusing days, a polling location. The clerk was a thin man named Aldous Petrie, who had the quality of someone who had been underpaid for so long he'd made a philosophy of it. He looked at Wyatt with recognition and at Evelyn with cautious interest. "I need to see the original territorial survey for the Crossbar Ranch property," Wyatt said. "The 1871 filing." Aldous went back into the record room. He was gone a while. When he came back, he looked mildly uncomfortable. "I've got the 1871 general survey for that township," he said, "but the individual parcel record for Mercer Land, the Crossbar Specific Plat, appears to have been refiled. There's a notation from February." He looked down at the ledger. "Survey amendment initiated by a private party. Standard procedure allows." Who initiated it?" Evelyn asked. Aldous looked at her over his glasses. "That's public record, ma'am. A Mr. Dodd, acting on behalf of—" He checked the notation. "Langford Land and Development." The room was quiet. "When was this refiling processed?" Evelyn asked. "February 14th. Before the Territorial Commission's spring session," she said, to no one in particular. "Is there a problem?" Aldous asked, looking between them. "Can I see the refiled document?" Evelyn asked. He produced it. She read it the way she had read Victor's copy at the fence line, carefully, turning pages, going back. Wyatt watched her face. He had learned in 12 days that her face was a reliable instrument. When she showed nothing, it meant something significant was happening behind it. She looked up. "This amendment removes approximately 4 acres from the northeastern boundary of the Crossbar property and redistributes it to the adjoining parcel, which is currently held by Langford Land and Development," Aldous said quietly. "And what adjoining parcel accesses the northern tributary of Slate Creek?" she asked. Aldous blinked. "That would be the disputed 4 acres, which means control of the tributary water rights," Evelyn said. Aldous looked at the ledger. He looked at the wall. He looked like a man who had just understood something he wished he hadn't. "Mrs. Mercer," he said carefully, "I processed that amendment in good faith. The documentation appeared—" "I'm sure it did," she said, not unkindly. "I'd like a certified copy of the original 1871 plat, whatever version of it still exists here. And I'd like a list of all survey amendments filed in this county in the last 24 months involving Langford Land and Development." Aldous looked at her for a long moment. "That's a significant request," he said. "It's a public record request," she said. He went back into the record room. Wyatt leaned against the counter and looked at her. "How did you know about the water rights?" he said, low. "I didn't," she said. "But when someone falsifies a boundary survey for 4 acres of scrubgrass in Montana, they're not doing it because they want the grass." She kept her voice down too, matching his register. "Water rights in this valley are what make land worth owning. If Langford controls the tributary, he controls who can run cattle on the eastern slopes. That's not 4 acres. That's leverage over every ranch that uses Slate Creek." "How many ranches is that?" She met his eyes. "How many of your neighbors have been struggling in the past 2 years?" He thought about Chester. He thought about the Dunmore family, who'd sold off their south pasture in the spring. He thought about old Ray Faskin, who'd been talking about pulling up stakes since winter. "Most of them," he said. She nodded, just once. Aldous came back with a stack of documents. The list of Langford-involved survey amendments in the past 24 months was 6 pages long. They drove home in a quiet that was different from the previous ones, tighter, with a current under it. Evelyn had the documents on her lap and was reading as they moved, which meant she was a person who could read in a moving wagon without getting sick, which Wyatt filed away as another thing he hadn't expected about her. 6 pages, he said after a while. 11 ranches, she said without looking up. 8 of those amendments filed within 30 days of each other, which means they were done in sequence, not opportunistically, methodically. She turned a page. Someone helped him design this. It's too systematic for one man's greed. Someone understood the territorial water law well enough to exploit the filing gaps. Meaning there's a lawyer in this somewhere. She looked up at the road finally. Or a judge. Wyatt said nothing for a long stretch of road. You understand, he said, that if what you're saying is right, this isn't just about our north boundary. No, she said. It isn't. And you understand that Victor Langford is not a man who reacts well to being cornered. She looked at him steadily. I understand that he came to our fence line yesterday, expecting to see a rancher who was tired and behind, and didn't have anyone in his corner who knew what they were looking at. She paused. He got something different. Wyatt looked at the road. You could have left it, he said. Taken the paper at face value. A lot of people would have. I know, she said simply. She went back to reading. He didn't say anything else for a while. The road climbed toward the ridge, and the afternoon light came at a low angle across the valley. And from up here, you could see most of the ranches that lined Slate Creek. A dozen weathered spreads, people he'd known for years. People who were unknowingly sitting inside a machine that had been quietly arranged to crush them. Something moved in his chest. It was not quite anger, though anger was part of it. It was the specific feeling of a man who has been surviving in a small circle and suddenly understands that the circle has been deliberately drawn small. Evelyn, he said. She looked up. What do you need to build a case? He said. She regarded him for a moment. Then she looked back at the documents. Time, she said. The original surveys from as many of these 11 ranches as I can access. Testimony from the affected landowners, if they're willing. She turned a page. And I need to find out who Dodd is. The surveyor. Because no one files 11 fraudulent boundary amendments without leaving a trail, and surveyors have to sign their work. I know a few of those ranchers, Wyatt said. Most of them, actually. I thought you might, she said. Some of them won't want to get involved. They're scared, or they've given up, or they think it won't make any difference. Some of them will, she said. He nodded at the road. I'll take you to meet Chester Pruitt first, he said. He's been ranching this valley for 30 years. If there's history on Langford in this county, Chester knows it. Evelyn closed the document she was reading and set the stack carefully on the seat between them. One more thing, she said. What? Langford knows we went to the clerk's office, she said. Aldous Petrie is a decent man, but he's underpaid and nervous, and men like Victor have a way of knowing things quickly. He'll be aware by tomorrow morning that I asked for that amendment list. Wyatt hadn't thought about that. He thought about it now. So he knows we're looking, he said. He knows, she said, which means we're not looking quietly anymore, which means he'll start moving faster. She looked at him directly. I want you to know that before we go any further, because once we go further, we don't get to go back to where we were this morning. He looked at her. Were you planning to go back? He said. She held his gaze. Something in her face shifted. Not soft exactly, but open in a way she didn't usually allow. No, she said, but it's your land. It should be your choice. He turned back to the road. The crossbar was visible now from the ridge, the iron bars at the fence post catching the late light, the barn roof with its whirring sag, the east pasture where the trough now held water without losing it. It stopped being just my choice, he said, about 12 days ago. She didn't answer that, but she didn't look away from the road either, and her hands, which had been holding the documents, came to rest in her lap. Still. Not tense, just still. That, he had learned, was what it looked like when Evelyn Hale had decided something. Chester Pruitt listened to everything without interrupting, which was unusual for him. He sat at his own kitchen table with his coffee going cold. There was something about a Mercer and a cold coffee cup that was becoming a pattern, and his expression went through careful to troubled to something harder to name. When Evelyn finished laying out what she'd found, he was quiet for a long moment. Ray Faskin, he said finally. What about him? Wyatt asked. Ray sold his east parcels in January, said the bank was pressing him. Chester turned his cup slowly. But Ray's always been solid. I couldn't figure why the bank would press him, year like last year, decent cattle prices. He looked at Evelyn. You're saying the boundary amendment on Ray's north edge cut him off from the creek tributary, If the pattern holds, Evelyn said, yes. His cattle would have been pushed onto land with no reliable water access on the eastern slope. By winter, that's expensive. By spring, if the bank has any interest in seeing him fail. The bank in Millbrook, Chester said slowly. Who holds the loan paper on most of these ranches? Evelyn asked. Chester and Wyatt looked at each other. Territorial Bank of Millbrook, Wyatt said. And who is on the board of the Territorial Bank of Millbrook? Evelyn said. To your knowledge? Chester set his cup down with a sound that was small and final. Victor Langford has been on that board since 1879, he said. The kitchen was very quiet. It's the same machine, Evelyn said. The survey amendment removes the water access. The drought, or the hard winter, or the bad season makes the land less viable. The bank calls the note. The land goes at distressed prices to a buyer of record who turns out to be a subsidiary of Langford Land and Development. She looked at both of them. He's been running this for at least 2 years, maybe longer. Chester let out a breath through his teeth. I'm 63 years old, he said. I've been watching men like Victor Langford operate my whole life. I never saw one put a machine together quite this clean. He looked at Evelyn with an expression that was both admiring and deeply unhappy. How do we stop it? Evelyn folded her hands on Chester's table. We have to expose the survey fraud before the fall commission session. That's the window where Langford can formalize the boundary changes into permanent territorial record. If they get formalized, the legal challenge becomes 10 times harder. How long do we have? Wyatt asked. The fall session convenes in 9 weeks, she said. Chester whistled softly. That's not a lot of time, Wyatt said. No, Evelyn said, but it's enough. If I can get statements from 5 of the affected ranchers and obtain the original survey documentation for comparison, I can build a fraud filing substantial enough that the commission will have to address it before certifying any boundary changes. She paused. The harder part is Dodd, the surveyor. If I can find where Dodd's other certifications are on file and show inconsistency in his methodology across the 11 amendments. I know a man in Helena, Chester said slowly. Used to work in the Territorial Surveyor's General Office before he retired. Name's Garfield Oakes. He knows every surveyor registered in Montana going back 30 years. If this Dodd is using a false registration or a revoked license, can you contact him? Evelyn asked. I can write today, Chester said. They looked at each other, Chester and Evelyn, 2 people who had just, without any ceremony at all, decided they were on the same side of something large and dangerous. Wyatt watched this happen and felt the particular kind of displaced helplessness of a man who has always managed his own problems alone and is just now discovering that some problems are better than what he could manage alone. Not because he isn't capable, but because the problem is bigger than one person was ever meant to carry. There's something else, he said. Both of them looked at him. Langford knows we pulled the records, he said. He's going to come back, and next time it won't be a neighborly visit. Evelyn's expression didn't change, but her eyes, which were already attentive, went a degree more attentive, the way a compass needle goes when it finds north. I know, she said. I want you to understand what that means, Wyatt said. Out here, away from town, a man like that. Wyatt, she said, with a patience that had a quiet edge to it, I grew up watching my father take records home at night because men like Victor Langford had people in his office. I understand what it means. He looked at her. All right, he said. Chester refilled everyone's coffee, hot this time, and the 3 of them sat around the table in the long afternoon and began, carefully and with the deliberate precision of people who understood they would not get a second chance at this, to build something that might hold against a man who had spent years making sure nothing could. Outside, the valley stretched southward under a hard blue Montana sky, the creek winking in the distance, the ranches of 12 families laid out across the grass like everything worth fighting for, patient and unaware and waiting. Part 3. The Dangerous Gamble. Garfield Oakes wrote back in 11 days. Chester brought the letter out to the crossbar on a Thursday morning, writing harder than his bad knee usually allowed, and Wyatt saw him coming from the barn and knew before Chester had even reined in that the letter was not good news delivered in a simple way. Evelyn was at the kitchen table when they came in. She had been there since before dawn, which was her habit now when she was working through something. The documents spread in a particular order that Wyatt had learned not to disturb, the pencil moving steadily, the coffee cup getting cold on her left side. She looked up when they came in and read Chester's face the same way Wyatt had. "Sit down," she said. Chester sat. He put the letter on the table. "Garfield says there is no surveyor named Dodd registered with the Territorial Office. Not currently, not in the past 15 years. The name appears once in the general records. A provisional apprentice certificate issued in 1871, never renewed, never completed." He paused. "Which means every survey amendment that Dodd signed is fraudulent on its face. The signatory doesn't legally exist." "That's good," Wyatt said. "That's what we needed." "There's more," Chester said. Evelyn had already picked up the letter and was reading it. "Garfield says he mentioned the name to a colleague in Helena," Chester said. Casually. He didn't know it was sensitive. By the next morning, he had a visitor at his home, a man he didn't know. The man told him that digging into old surveyor records was a fine way to lose a comfortable retirement. Chester's jaw worked. Garfield is 68 years old. He lives alone. The kitchen went quiet. "He was threatened," Evelyn said. "Not a question." "Politely," Chester said. "But yes." Wyatt put both hands flat on the table. He didn't say anything for a moment because the thing moving through him was anger, and anger needed a second to become useful before you let it out. "Langford has someone in Helena," he said. "Someone with enough reach to know within 24 hours that a retired records clerk was asking questions," Evelyn said. She set the letter down. She was quiet in that specific way, the compass needle way, and Wyatt waited. "This changes our timeline," she said finally. "How?" Chester asked. "If Langford has contacts in the Territorial Office, he may be able to accelerate the commission session or influence who sits on the panel." She looked at the documents spread in front of her. "We have 7 weeks. I thought that was enough. Now, I'm not sure." "So what do we do?" Chester said. Evelyn picked up her pencil. She looked at the table of documents, the survey amendments, the county records, the timeline she'd drawn out across 3 sheets of paper taped together, connecting dates and names and amounts with lines that told a story Victor Langford had spent years making sure no one would ever be able to read. "We let him think he's winning," she said. Both men looked at her. "Victor came to this fence line 2 weeks ago to take a read," she said. "He left knowing we'd pulled the records, which made him move faster. The threat to Garfield proves that. But fast men make mistakes that careful men don't." She set the pencil down. "If Victor believes he's already ahead of us, he'll stop being careful. He'll start consolidating. And when he consolidates, he'll leave a cleaner trail." "You want to pretend to back down," Wyatt said. "I want you to go see him," she said. The room was very still. "I want you to ride out to Langford's property and ask for a meeting. Tell him the survey business has you concerned and you'd like to understand his position. Tell him your wife's," she said the word without hesitation, "has been looking into things and it's making the household tense and you'd like to resolve it quietly." She met his eyes. "Let him believe you're a man whose wife is running ahead of him and he's trying to rein her back in. He'll believe that readily. Men like Victor always do." Wyatt looked at her for a long moment. "You want me to look weak in front of Victor Langford?" "I want you to look manageable," she said. "There's a difference. Weak men bore him. Manageable men are useful." Chester rubbed the back of his neck. "That's a cold calculation, Evelyn." "Yes," she said simply. "It is." Wyatt stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at the valley, at the creek catching the morning light, at the pastures that had been in his family for 40 years, at the fence post with the iron bars his father had driven into the ground in a time when you could still believe that what you built stayed yours. He thought about Thomas, about a 9-year-old boy who had sat on a fence rail with his arms out, daring himself to stay balanced, terrified and delighted, and who had never gotten the chance to inherit any of this. "How long do you need?" he said. 3 weeks, Evelyn said. "If you can buy me 3 weeks with Victor, believing he has the upper hand, I can have enough documentation to file a fraud complaint with the Territorial Attorney General directly, bypassing the commission entirely." Wyatt turned from the window. "The Attorney General," Chester said slowly. "You can do that?" "The fraud complaint provisions in the Territorial Charter allow a direct filing if the evidence involves a public official, Evelyn said. And if what I think is true, that someone in the Millbrook County Clerk's office processed those amendments knowing they were fraudulent, then there's a public official involved. She looked at Chester. Aldous Petrie may be innocent, but someone above him isn't. Chester let out a long breath. There's a county commissioner named Harlan Bright, who's been very friendly with Langford's people for the past 3 years. I'll need everything you know about Harlan Bright, Evelyn said. Dates, meetings, anything visible. I can get that, Chester said. Wyatt looked at Evelyn. If I go to Langford and he doesn't believe me, he said, it puts us in a worse position than we're in now. I know, she said, and if he figures out what we're actually doing, I know that too, she said. Her voice was steady, not unconcerned, steady in the way of someone who has calculated the risk honestly and decided it's the right one anyway. You don't have to do this. There are other approaches, slower ones. We don't have time for slower, he said. No, she said, we don't. He looked at her for a long moment, at the documents spread around her, at the pencil still in her hand, at the specific quality of her focus that he had been watching for 3 weeks now and still hadn't quite found a word for. It was not confidence exactly, because confidence could be performed. It was more like she had looked at the problem from every angle available to her and had chosen the best path forward and was now simply walking it, one step at a time, without drama and without pretending it wasn't hard. All right, he said. I'll go tomorrow. He went alone, which was the point. Victor Langford's property was 12 miles south and sat at the top of a rise that looked down over the whole Central Valley in a way that was not accidental. Victor had bought the high ground deliberately, years ago, and had expanded from it in every direction since. The main house was large and recently painted and had a porch that wrapped 3 sides, and there were hired men visible at the barn and the corrals who stopped what they were doing when Wyatt rode up and watched him without pretending not to. Victor came out onto the porch before Wyatt had fully dismounted, which meant someone had seen him coming a good while back. He had his jacket on despite the heat, which meant he'd had time to put it on, which meant he'd been told. Mercer, Victor said, with the warm smile that Wyatt now understood was a working tool. Come up. They sat on the porch. Victor's man brought coffee without being asked. Wyatt accepted a cup and held it and looked out over the valley the way a man does when he has something to say and isn't sure how to start, which was not entirely a performance because the valley was genuinely something to look at from up here. All of it laid out, the creek threading through it, the ranches like dark marks against the grass, everything small and far away and exposed. I appreciate you seeing me, Wyatt said. Always, Victor said. What's on your mind? Wyatt let a silence develop. He turned the cup in his hands. My wife has been looking into the survey business, he said. Since your visit, she's thorough. He said the word with the tone of a man who finds thoroughness in a woman mildly exhausting, which was a performance, in which he disliked himself for slightly. Victor's expression did the thing it had done at the fence line, just briefly, the pleasantness over something else. She seems like a capable woman. She is, Wyatt said. She came from a county records background, her father's work, and she has a way of getting into the documents and then not coming out. He paused. It's causing some friction at home. I'm sorry to hear that, Victor said, with the warmth of a man who was not sorry at all. I'd like to resolve the boundary question, Wyatt said, quietly, before it becomes something bigger than it needs to be. He looked at Victor. I was wondering if there was a conversation to be had about the practicalities. Victor was quiet for a moment. He looked out over the valley with an expression that managed to be both relaxed and predatory, which was a difficult combination, and he wore it well. I think there's always a conversation to be had between reasonable men, Victor said. The boundary matter is genuinely a small thing, a few acres. What I'd hate is to see a small thing become a complicated thing because of documentation instincts that are better suited to city work than frontier circumstances. My thinking exactly, Wyatt said. Victor turned to look at him directly. He was reading him. Wyatt could feel it, the same way you feel weather coming, a pressure change. Victor was good at reading people. He had built his entire operation on it. Wyatt looked back at him with the expression of a tired man who has a complicated household and not enough sleep, which required less acting than he wanted to admit. "What would resolution look like from your end?" Wyatt asked. "From my end," Victor said, "resolution is simple. The survey amendment stands, the boundary reflects the corrected measurement, and in exchange, I think we could find some arrangement regarding the spring grazing access on the South Ridge that would be advantageous for the crossbar." He said this easily, the way you discuss weather. Compensatory access, essentially. Keeps everyone whole. It was elegant. Wyatt saw it clearly now. The offer of something small and real in exchange for ratifying the fraud. Something Wyatt could point to and say, he gave me grazing rights, and the transaction would look bilateral, would look like a deal, and the survey amendment would become history. "That sounds worth discussing," Wyatt said carefully. "I'd want to put something in writing," Victor said. "Just for clarity. My attorney can draft something simple." "Of course," Wyatt said. Victor smiled. The real one this time, or closer to real, the one that showed up when he thought he had already won. "Give me a week. I'll have something sent over." Wyatt finished his coffee. He stood, put his hat on, shook Victor's hand. He walked to his horse and mounted and rode back down the hill at a pace that said nothing was urgent. He did not look back. He rode 3 miles before he stopped on the ridge above the creek and let himself feel what he'd been holding down for the past hour. His hands, he noticed, were not quite steady on the reins. Not from fear, from the sustained effort of being someone he wasn't in front of a man who deserved considerably worse than a polite conversation on a painted porch. He thought about the 11 ranches, about Ray Faskin selling his East parcels in January, and old Ray's face the last time Wyatt had seen him at the general store, which had looked like a man who had given up on something and was trying to get used to the lightness of it. He rode home. Evelyn was waiting on the porch when he came up the drive, which surprised him because she was not generally a waiting on the porch kind of person. She had a cup of coffee and her notebook and was writing something, but she looked up when he rode in and watched him dismount and come up the steps with an attention that was different from her usual working attention. "Well," she said. "He's sending a draft agreement in a week," Wyatt said. "Grazing access on the South Ridge in exchange for ratifying the boundary amendment." She exhaled through her nose. "He moved faster than I expected." "He thinks it's done," Wyatt said. He sat down in the other porch chair. There were 2 now, where there had been one when she arrived, because at some point in the past 10 days she had pulled a second one out of the storage room and put it there without comment, and he had not commented either. "He's going to have his attorney draft something." "Which attorney?" "He didn't say." She was already thinking. He could see it, the slight focus shift that meant she was moving pieces around in her mind. "If it's the attorney from Helena, the one who handles his territorial filings, that gives us something. The draft agreement will be on letterhead, which means we have a paper connection between Langford's legal representation and the boundary fraud." "Is that useful?" "It's a thread," she said. "We pull enough threads, the whole thing unravels," he said. She looked at him. Something in her expression shifted, not soft, not sentimental, but present in a way that acknowledged what he'd just done, the specific cost of it. "That was hard," she said. Not a question. "It was necessary," he said, which was true but also a deflection, and she probably knew it. "Both things can be true," she said quietly. He looked out at the valley. The evening light was coming in low and gold from the west, the kind of light that made the valley look like something a painter invented, and he had lived here his whole life and still wasn't immune to it. "Chester came by while you were gone," Evelyn said. He looked at her. He spoke with Dunmore. The Dunmore family on the East Fork. They lost their South Water access in a survey amendment 14 months ago, and they know it was wrong. They just didn't know what to do about it. She paused. Chester also found out that Harlan Bright, the county commissioner, has been receiving a monthly payment from a land management trust that Chester traced to a subsidiary of Langford Land and Development. Wyatt was quiet. "How did Chester find that?" he said. "Chester Pruitt," Evelyn said, "has been in this valley for 30 years and knows where to ask questions that don't look like questions." She almost smiled. "He's more useful than he appears." "I know that," Wyatt said. "I've known it for 30 years. She turned a page in her notebook. The Dunmores will sign a statement. Ray Faskin, Chester thinks, might if he's approached carefully. There's also a family named Keller on the northern end of the valley who lost access to a feeder stream last year. Chester says the wife is the one to talk to. She's been angry about it since it happened and hasn't had anywhere to put the anger. That's 3 statements, Wyatt said. You said you needed 5. I said 5 was enough. More is better. She looked at him. I need to talk to them myself. I can get more from a direct conversation than Chester relaying my questions. Then we'll go, Wyatt said, starting Saturday. She nodded. Then she said, there's a problem. He waited. Dodd, she said. The Phantom Surveyor, I know his registration is fraudulent, I know his certifications are invalid, but I need to know who he actually is. Because when we file with the Attorney General, they're going to ask, and I need an answer. She tapped the notebook with her pencil. A real person signed those amendments, with a false name, but a real hand. The handwriting is consistent across all 11 documents. I've compared them. Same person, every time. Can you identify someone from handwriting? Wyatt asked. No, she said, but I know someone who might be able to tell me where the handwriting leads. She paused. There was a man in Columbus, a document examiner, worked with the courts. I wrote to him 10 days ago. Wyatt looked at her. You wrote to him 10 days ago and didn't mention it. I didn't want to mention it until I knew he was willing to help, she said. I received his reply this morning. She reached into her notebook and produced a folded letter. His name is Edmund Farr. He says the methodology in the amendments is consistent with training he recognizes from a surveying school in St. Louis that operated between 1868 and 1876. He can identify specific training markers in the calculation methods. He says he can likely narrow the field to 2 or 3 candidates who graduated from that school and had their provisional licenses lapse without renewal. Wyatt stared at her. You've been running your own investigation, he said. I've been building a case, she said. There's a difference. She met his eyes. I should have told you about Farr earlier. You're right about that. He was quiet for a moment. He was not angry. He recognized that clearly, but something in him needed a second to recalibrate, the way you recalibrate when the ground does something you didn't expect. We are supposed to be doing this together, he said. Yes, she said. I know. A pause. I'm not accustomed to doing things together. It landed differently than she probably intended it to. Not as an excuse, but as something true and specific about her, a seam visible in the practical surface she showed the world. 11 years of managing a household alone. 11 years of being the person who held things together while others depended on the holding. You didn't develop habits of partnership in 11 years like that. You developed habits of self-reliance so deep they operated before you decided to use them. He knew something about that. All right, he said. From here on, you tell me what you're running, both directions. Both directions, she agreed. Then, I've also been looking at the night the threat was made to Garfield Oaks. What about it? Garfield mentioned his visitor came the morning after his colleague asked around about Dodd. That colleague is a man named Pressler who still works in the territorial office, which means Pressler told someone within hours. She looked at her notebook, which means Pressler is either on Langford's payroll or terrified enough to report immediately. Either way, Wyatt said, he's a thread. Either way, she said. The evening had settled fully now, the light gone from gold to the flat gray blue that came before dark. Somewhere in the east pasture a calf was calling for its mother with the particular persistent urgency that Wyatt had always found both annoying and oddly moving, and the mother was answering from somewhere further away than seemed comfortable. Victor is going to send that draft agreement, Wyatt said, and when I don't sign it fast enough, he's going to send something less friendly. I know, Evelyn said. 3 weeks is still the timeline. 3 weeks, she said. Edmund Farr needs 2 weeks to compile his analysis. I need the 5 statements, and I need one more thing. She looked at him steadily. I need the original deed and survey documentation from your father's homestead filing, the 1871 original, whatever you have here at the ranch. It's in the strongbox under the bedroom floor, he said. She blinked, just slightly. You have the original documents. My father kept everything, Wyatt said. I haven't looked at that box in 6 years, but everything from the original homestead claim should be in it. Something moved across her face. Relief, but the specific relief of someone who has been building a structure and just found a missing support beam. That, she said, might be the most important thing in this case. He got up. He went inside and down the hall to the bedroom, his bedroom, the one he'd slept in alone for 7 years. And he moved the rug and lifted the floorboard and pulled out the iron strongbox his father had brought from Missouri in 1868, and which Wyatt had not opened since the year after Clara died, when he'd put the insurance papers in it and tried not to think about why he needed insurance papers. He brought it to the kitchen table. He found the key on the ring he kept in the top drawer behind the broken watch he meant to repair, and never did. The lock turned. The box opened. The smell of old paper came up, specific and dry and like something sealed away from time. Evelyn leaned over and looked at the contents. He watched her face. Her expression went very still. "Wyatt," she said. "What?" She reached in carefully and lifted out a folded document. Heavy paper, the kind they used for official territorial filings in the early days, with a wax seal that had held its shape for 50 years. "This is the original 1871 plat survey for the Crossbar homestead," she said, "signed by the Territorial Surveyor General." She looked at the signature. "And it establishes your north boundary at the tributary center line." She looked up at him. "Victor's amendment moves that boundary 40 feet south of the center line, but the original plat puts the center line inside your property." "Meaning his amendment doesn't just take 4 acres, Wyatt said. "Meaning his amendment puts your boundary inside what the territorial plat says is your own land," she said, "which is not a survey discrepancy, which is not a gray area." She held the document with both hands and looked at him with an expression that was the closest thing to shaken that he had seen on her face. "This is theft of a deeded property, right guaranteed by the original territorial charter. If I file this alongside the fraud complaint, it's not 11 ranches anymore," Wyatt said. "No," she said. "With this document, it's a criminal case." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the calf had found its mother. The pasture went silent. The Montana dark came down over the valley without asking anyone's permission, the way it always did, indifferent and complete. And in the kitchen of the Crossbar Ranch, a woman who had come on a stagecoach with one bag sat with a 50-year-old piece of paper in her hands that was either the beginning of something or the end of it. And a man who had spent 7 years surviving stood across the table from her and understood, with the specific clarity that arrives sometimes in ordinary kitchens at ordinary hours, that surviving and living were 2 entirely different things, and that somewhere in the last 3 weeks, he had started doing the second one again without noticing the moment it changed. He didn't say any of that. He said, "I'll make more coffee." She said yes, and went back to the document. And the night settled in around the Crossbar, and the work went on, and 3 weeks felt like exactly enough time and nowhere near enough time at all, which is the condition under which most things worth doing have always been done. Part 4. One hearing changes everything. The draft agreement from Victor's attorney arrived on a Wednesday, 8 days after Wyatt's visit to the Hilltop house. It came by courier, a young man Wyatt didn't recognize, riding a horse that was too good for a messenger. And it was 6 pages long and written in the kind of legal language that was designed to sound reasonable while meaning something else entirely. Evelyn read it at the kitchen table without expression. Wyatt stood by the window and watched her read it the way he'd watched her read everything over the past weeks. The stillness, the pencil moving occasionally to mark something in the margin, the coffee going cold. When she finished, she set it down and looked at the wall for a moment. "He's added a clause," she said. "What kind of clause?" "A release of all future claims against Langford land and development arising from boundary or water access disputes." She looked at Wyatt. "If you sign this, you can't file anything. Not now, not ever. Not for the Crossbar. And technically, the language is broad enough to cover your participation in any joint filing with neighboring ranches." Wyatt stared at her. "He knows." "He suspects," she said. "He doesn't know what we have, but he suspects we've been talking to the neighbors." She tapped the document. "This clause isn't about the 4 acres. This is about shutting down everything before it reaches a filing." "So he's not as confident as he appeared on that porch," Wyatt said. No man is ever as confident as he appears on his own porch, she said. She picked up her pencil and wrote something at the top of the first page. Don't respond yet. Tell Chester to have Ray Faskin ready to sign his statement by Friday. I need to move the timeline. I thought we had 3 weeks. We did, she said. We now have 10 days. Well, those 10 days had a particular quality to them that Wyatt would remember for the rest of his life. Not clearly, not in sequence, but in fragments. The way you remember something that was happening too fast and at too high a pitch for ordinary memory to organize properly. He remembered riding to the Keller farm on a Thursday afternoon and sitting in May Keller's kitchen while Evelyn talked with her. May was 54 and had the angular, watchful quality of a woman who had been waiting a long time for someone to take her anger seriously. She had signed the statement in 20 minutes. Her husband, Gerald, who had been skeptical and stood in the doorway with his arms crossed for most of the conversation, signed it 10 minutes after his wife. If May's signing, I'm signing, he said, which was not complicated reasoning but was solid enough. He remembered the night the fence on the north boundary was cut. He found it at 4 a.m. when the cattle woke him with the sound of a herd that has discovered an opening and is considering it. 3 posts pulled clean, wire-coiled, and laid aside. Not cut in anger, laid aside with deliberate neatness, which was more threatening than anger would have been. A message about capability. He repaired it before dawn without telling Evelyn, and then felt wrong about not telling her, and told her at breakfast. She put her coffee cup down. Where exactly on the north boundary? West of the tributary crossing, he said. She was quiet for a moment. That's the section the original plat document protects most clearly, she said. He's not just threatening, he's establishing physical presence on the disputed ground. For what reason? If there's any question later about who was occupying the land during the dispute period, physical presence creates a complication. She looked at him. He has someone advising him who knows property law. This isn't Victor's instinct. This is counsel. His attorney, Wyatt said. Or someone above the attorney, she said. Someone who knows territorial commission procedure well enough to know that possession arguments carry weight. She stood up. I need to write to Edmund Farr today. If his handwriting analysis is complete, I need it now, not at the end of the week. Farr's response came 2 days later. Not a letter, but a full written report, 12 pages, with comparison charts that laid the 11 survey amendments' calculation methodology against the St. Louis Surveying School's documented training methods with a precision that Wyatt, reading over Evelyn's shoulder, found almost violent in its clarity. The man behind the Dodd signature was, according to Farr, almost certainly one of 3 former students. 2 of them had established verifiable careers in other states. The third, a man named Caleb Pruitt, no relation to Chester, had dropped from public record in Montana in 1877, the same year Langford Land and Development was formally incorporated. Caleb Pruitt, Evelyn said. She was already pulling a sheet from the document stack. Chester. Does Chester know that name? Wyatt was already putting his hat on. Chester knew the name. Chester knew it the way you know the name of a sore tooth. Not fondly, but specifically. Caleb Pruitt had worked briefly as an assistant to the county assessor in Millbrook in 1876 before disappearing from local employment under circumstances Chester described as murky and which Wyatt understood to mean something Chester didn't want to say plainly in front of Evelyn. There were accusations, Chester said carefully, about records, things not being where they were supposed to be. Nothing was ever formally charged. Because Langford moved him before anything could be charged, Evelyn said. Chester looked at her. That's my guess, too, he said. But a guess doesn't... I have his handwriting analysis, she said. And I have the survey amendments. And I have the original crossbar plat that predates every amendment he signed. She looked at Chester steadily. If I can find where Caleb Pruitt is currently living, I have a witness who is either going to cooperate because he wants a reduced charge or refuse to cooperate and face the full fraud complaint alongside Victor Langford. Chester was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Ray Faskin's second cousin is a deputy in Billings. He might know. Talk to Ray, Evelyn said. The name came back the next morning. Caleb Pruitt was living outside Billings under the name C.P. Rudd, working as a clerk in a freight company. He had a wife and 2 children. He had not, as far as anyone could determine, done survey work in 8 years. Oh, It was Wyatt who rode to Billings. Evelyn had wanted to come, and he had said no, firmly, for the first time about anything, and she had looked at him with an expression that said she was deciding whether to fight this, and then she had said, "All right, but you need to understand what he needs to hear." They sat at the kitchen table for an hour the night before he left. She explained it carefully. Not the legal argument, but the human one. What to say. What not to say. What Pruitt was afraid of and why the fear was working in their favor, not against it. "He's been waiting for this conversation for 8 years," she said. "Men like him always are. They do a thing they can't undo, and then they spend the rest of their lives waiting for the knock on the door." She looked at Wyatt. "Don't threaten him. Just tell him the door is already open. The only question is which side of it he wants to stand on." Wyatt found C.P. Rudd, Caleb Pruitt, at the freight office on a Tuesday afternoon. He was a small man in his mid-40s who had the look of someone who slept lightly and had for years. He saw Wyatt come in and something happened in his face immediately. A recognition, not of Wyatt specifically, but of the category of thing Wyatt represented. The conversation was not long. Wyatt said his name. He said where he was from. He put Edmund Farr's report on the counter between them, open to the comparison page without comment. Pruitt looked at it for a long time. "What do you want?" he said. His voice was flat. "A sworn statement," Wyatt said, "about who directed the surveys, who you reported to, who paid you." He paused. "And where the original legitimate survey records are, if they still exist." Pruitt's jaw worked. He looked at the window. He looked at the report. He looked at Wyatt with the exhausted eyes of a man who has been carrying something heavy for so long he's forgotten what it felt like not to. "My family," he said. "The complaint is against Langford and against whoever in the territorial office facilitated the filings," Wyatt said. "My wife is filing it. She's been specific about where the criminal liability sits." He held Pruitt's gaze. "You cooperate. You're a witness. You don't cooperate. You're a defendant. That's the whole of it." Pruitt put both hands flat on the counter. "The original surveys are in a storage room at Langford's Helena office," he said. "He kept them. I don't know why. Maybe because destroying them felt like destroying evidence and keeping them felt like keeping leverage. Men like him—" He stopped. "There's a filing cabinet in the back room. Gray. 3rd drawer." "Who in the territorial office?" Wyatt said. "A man named Pressler," Pruitt said. "He processed the amendments. He knew." He looked down at the counter. "He's been on Langford's salary since 1878. Indirect. Through the land trust." Wyatt looked at him for a moment. "My wife will send you the statement document," he said. "Sign it and have it notarized. Send it back within 4 days." He left before Pruitt could reconsider. He rode hard back to the crossbar. He was home by the following evening, saddle sore and tired in the bone-deep way of a man who has covered hard ground with something important riding on the outcome. He came up the porch steps and Evelyn was there. Not waiting, she was working, the notebook in her lap. But she looked up when she heard his horse and she looked at his face, and whatever she saw there made her set the notebook down. "He'll sign," Wyatt said. She closed her eyes for just a second. Then she opened them. "The original surveys?" "Langford's Helena office. He kept them." "Of course he did," she said very quietly. "Of course. There's more." He sat down. He was very tired. "Pressler, the territorial office man. He's been on Langford's payroll since 1878. She was quiet for a long moment. "That's the public official," she said. "That's the element that allows the direct filing with the Attorney General." She looked at him. "Wyatt, we have everything." He looked at her across the porch in the last of the evening light. This woman who had arrived with one bag on a stage from Columbus 41 days ago. And he thought about the letter he had written 6 months earlier. The careful, deliberate, almost cold letter about practical arrangements and working partnerships and the specific absence of anything resembling risk. And he understood with the particular clarity of a man who is too tired to protect himself from honest thought that he had written that letter to a version of the future he no longer wanted. He didn't say that. Not yet. "Get some sleep," she said. "I need you coherent tomorrow. We have to file before Victor's attorney sends a follow-up on the draft agreement." "You have everything ready?" he said. "I've been ready for 3 days," she said. "I was waiting for Pruitt." He almost laughed. He was too tired to actually laugh, but it moved through him, the impulse of it. "Of course you were," he said, and went inside. The filing went to the Territorial Attorney General's office in Helena on a Thursday, carried by Chester Pruitt himself, because Evelyn did not trust a courier for something that could not be reproduced, and Chester did not trust anyone else to do it correctly. The package was comprehensive. The original crossbar plat, Edmund Farr's handwriting analysis, 6 signed and notarized witness statements from affected landowners, the documentation of Pressler's payments through the land trust, and a 50-page fraud complaint that Evelyn had written by hand at the kitchen table over the course of 2 weeks, revised 4 times, and copied twice with a steadiness of hand that Wyatt found remarkable for someone working by lamplight at midnight. Chester was back in 4 days. The Attorney General's office had accepted the filing. A preliminary review had been ordered. The fall commission session had been stayed pending the review outcome. Victor Langford would have received notice of the stay the same day. What Victor did with that notice was to send a man to the crossbar 2 evenings later. Not himself, a man Wyatt didn't recognize, heavy-set, with the specific quality of someone employed for presence rather than conversation. He arrived at dusk and sat on his horse at the fence gate and called out for Wyatt, and when Wyatt came out to the porch, he said, with no particular emphasis, that Mr. Langford wished to convey that complications had a way of multiplying when people created them unnecessarily. Wyatt looked at the man for a moment. "Tell Mr. Langford," he said, "that my wife handles our legal correspondence and she'll be in contact with his attorney through the appropriate channels." The man looked at him. He looked at the house. He rode away. Wyatt came back inside. Evelyn was at the table. She had heard all of it through the open window. "He's scared," she said. "Scared men do stupid things," Wyatt said. "Yes," she said. "So we need the hearing to move quickly." She looked at him. "The Attorney General's office will schedule a preliminary commission hearing within 30 days of the filing. That's when we present the evidence in person." "In person," Wyatt said. "You and I both," she said. "Chester if he's willing, the Kellers and Ray Faskin if they'll come." "They'll come," Wyatt said. He knew these people. They would come. The hearing was scheduled for 23 days later in Millbrook, in the courthouse that also served as an assessor's office, an occasional polling location, the same building where Aldous Petrie had gone pale behind his counter 2 months ago, and where, Evelyn noted with the dry precision she applied to ironies, the fraudulent amendments had been processed and where they would now be dismantled. Victor arrived with 2 attorneys. This was the first thing Wyatt noticed when they walked into the hearing room. 2 men in identical dark suits flanking Victor like a wall, one of them the Helena attorney whose name had come up repeatedly and who had the polished, slightly bored expression of someone accustomed to winning before the proceedings started. Victor himself was in his good jacket. He looked at Wyatt when they came in. He did not look at Evelyn. That was a mistake. Wyatt registered it as one immediately. The commission panel was 3 men, territorial appointees, none of whom Wyatt knew by face, but whose names Evelyn had researched and annotated in her notebook with the calm thoroughness of a woman who did not walk into rooms unprepared. The chairman was a man named Horace Devlin, 60 years old, with a reputation for impatience with theatrics and tolerance for evidence. Victor's lead attorney opened. He was good. Wyatt acknowledged this privately and without pleasure. He established the boundary amendment as a standard surveying correction, placed the Dodd documentation as legitimate on its face, and managed to reference Evelyn, without naming her, as a party whose background in county records might predispose her to see complications where none existed. He did this smoothly, with a kind of courteous condescension that was designed to make her seem like a well-meaning amateur. Horace Devlin looked at the ceiling briefly during this section. Wyatt read that as a sign. Then Evelyn stood up. She did not have theatrics. She had never had them. What she had was a stack of documents organized in exact sequence, a clarity of presentation that came from having explained the same material to herself approximately 400 times over the past 6 weeks, and the specific authority of a person who is not performing confidence because they don't need to perform it. She began with the 1871 plat. She placed the certified copy before the commission and walked through the boundary language in the original territorial charter with the patience of someone who understands that detail is not tedious when it is the difference between justice and fraud. She placed Victor's survey amendment beside it. She placed Edmund Farr's handwriting analysis beside that. She said without inflection, "The individual who signed these amendments as a licensed surveyor named Dodd has no registration in the territorial records, current or historical, beyond a lapsed provisional apprentice certificate from 1871. Every survey amendment in this filing is therefore invalid on its face, signed by a legally non-existent professional acting under a false credential." Victor's lead attorney interjected. His objection was procedural and technically sound. Devlin allowed it and then asked Evelyn to continue. She placed Caleb Pruitt's notarized statement on the table. The attorney's objection this time was less smooth. She placed the 6 landowner statements. She placed the documentation of Pressler's payments. She placed the letter from Garfield Oaks describing his visit from an unannounced man the morning after his colleague asked questions about Dodd's registration. She built it the way she had built everything. One piece, then the next, each one connected to the last by a line of logic so clean and continuous that the overall picture assembled itself in the room without her having to announce what it was. She did not say Victor Langford is a criminal. She laid out what he had done and let the commission read the conclusion in the evidence itself. She was 40 minutes into the presentation when Victor leaned over to his lead attorney and said something low and quick. The attorney stood up. "The commission should be aware," he said, with the composed voice of a man changing strategy mid-field, "that Mrs. Mercer has no formal legal standing before this body. She is not a licensed attorney, and her presentation, however thorough, does not constitute—" "She is a filing party under Territorial Charter Section 14, Devlin said, without looking up from the documents in front of him. "She has standing. Continue, Mrs. Mercer." The attorney sat down. Victor's expression did not change, but something behind it did, a recalibration, a tightening, the look of a man who has just found out the room he thought he owned has different dimensions than he believed. Evelyn continued. She brought up the pattern, the sequence of the 11 amendments, the timing relative to the bank's loan call notices, the relationship between the water access removals and the subsequent property distress sales. She named the subsidiary companies that had purchased the distressed properties. She named the dates. She placed the corporate filing documents that linked those subsidiaries to Langford Land and Development in a chain of ownership that was not hidden so much as nested, each layer designed to add one more step between the transaction and the man who ordered it. Ray Faskin was called to speak. He was 61 and had the dry, blunt manner of a man who had decided on the drive over that he was going to say what was true and not dress it up, and he did exactly that. He said he'd run his east parcels without water trouble for 22 years, that the survey amendment had appeared without his knowledge or consent, that he had lost creek access the following spring, that the bank had called his loan in July, and that he had sold land his father homesteaded because he had no choice. He said it in about 90 seconds. He sat down. May Keller was next. She was not as brief. She had been angry for 14 months, and she allocated that anger across about 4 minutes of precise and specific testimony that made the hearing room very quiet in a particular way. When she sat down, her husband Gerald put his hand over hers on the table and she let him. Victor's second attorney, the younger one, who had been silent until now, tried to challenge the chain of subsidiary ownership documentation on grounds of document authenticity. Evelyn produced the original corporate filing stamps from the Territorial Business Registry. The challenge dissolved. Then came Edmund Farr's testimony, delivered by written deposition since he was in Columbus, read into the record by Devlin himself. The handwriting analysis was specific, technical, and unambiguous. Caleb Pruitt, C.P. Rudd, was the man behind the Dodd signature. His training methodology was identifiable. His lapsed credential was documented. His notarized statement, in which he named Victor Langford as the directing party and Pressler as the processing facilitator, was entered into the record. Victor's lead attorney made one more attempt. He argued that a single witness with obvious incentive to cooperate for reduced liability was insufficient to establish direction, that Pruitt's statement proved Pruitt's crime but not Langford's instruction. Evelyn let him finish. Then she placed the last document on the table. It was a payment record, part of the land trust documentation she had subpoenaed through the Attorney General's office, showing a series of payments to a consulting account in Pruitt's former name at intervals that corresponded precisely with the dates of each survey amendment filing. Mr. Pruitt received payment, she said, for each amendment within 30 days of filing. The payment source is the Langford Land Trust. That is not cooperation incentive. That is a payroll record. The hearing room was very quiet. Devlin looked at the document for a long time. He looked at the other two commission members. He looked at Victor Langford, who was looking at the table in front of him with an expression that was not quite anything anymore. Not confident, not pleasant, not the relaxed authority of a man at the top of a hill looking down. "We'll take a recess," Devlin said. The recess was 40 minutes. Wyatt and Evelyn sat in the hallway on a bench that was not comfortable and did not speak much. Chester had brought coffee from somewhere, and it was bad coffee, but it was hot, and Wyatt drank it without complaint. Ray Faskin sat down the bench with his hat in his hands, turning it slowly. May Keller had gone outside, and her husband was with her. "You did everything you could do," Wyatt said to Evelyn. She looked at the floor. "I know," she said. Not with satisfaction, with the flat exhaustion of someone who has been holding maximum effort for weeks and has finally set it down. "Whatever happens in there," he started. "Don't," she said gently. "Not yet." He stopped. He drank the bad coffee. Chester sat across from them and read a newspaper he had also produced from somewhere, which Wyatt found both irrelevant and deeply comforting. The commission recalled them at 2:30. Devlin spoke for 11 minutes. He went through the findings methodically: the fraudulent survey credentials, the systematic amendment pattern, the water rights impact, the connection to the loan call sequence, the subsidiary ownership chain, the payment records. He announced that the commission was voiding all 11 survey amendments in full, effective immediately, and was referring the matter to the Territorial Attorney General for criminal investigation of survey fraud, wire fraud through the banking relationship, and abuse of public office in connection with the Pressler payments. He said the commission was making a formal record of commendation for the quality and completeness of the fraud documentation presented by the filing party. He looked at Evelyn when he said it, not performatively, just directly, the way Devlin apparently looked at everything. Victor Langford left the hearing room with his two attorneys before Devlin had finished speaking. He did not look at anyone on his way out. The room stayed quiet for a moment after the commission adjourned. Then Ray Faskin said, from down the bench, "Well." He said it with the particular weight of a man who has gotten back something he had stopped expecting to get back. May Keller, who had come back inside for the ruling, put her face in her hands for about 5 seconds. Then she took them away and her expression was perfectly composed, or as close to it as a person can manage when they are relieved enough to shake. Chester folded his newspaper. Wyatt looked at Evelyn. She was looking at the table. Her hands were in her lap. She was very still. He put his hand over hers, the way Gerald Keller had, without planning to, without a speech attached to it. And she looked down at his hand and then up at him, and whatever was in her face in that moment was not a thing she would have shown in a public hallway under ordinary circumstances, which told him it was the truest thing he'd seen from her since the day she stepped off a stagecoach with one bag and walked toward him without hesitation. "It's done," he said. "The criminal investigation still has to run," she said. "Evelyn." She looked at him. "It's done," he said again. She held his gaze. Something went through her face. Not quite relief, not quite collapse. The specific expression of a person who has been braced for a long time and has just learned it is safe to unbrace. "Yes," she said. "It is." Outside the Millbrook Courthouse, in the afternoon light of a Montana September, the valley was still there, the creek threading through it, the ranches like marks against the grass, everything that 12 families had built and nearly lost, laid out under a sky that had no interest in the drama of human affairs, and for that reason was exactly right. The drive home was quiet, the good kind. Part 5, A New Beginning Beyond Survival. The drive home from Millbrook took an hour and a half, the same as always, the road doing the same things it always did. Rough past the creek crossing, smoother on the upper stretch, the last ridge giving that view of the valley before the descent toward the crossbar. Wyatt had driven this road so many times in his life that he did it without thinking, which meant his mind was free to do other things, and what it did on the way home from the hearing was simply be quiet in a way it hadn't been quiet in a long time. Evelyn was asleep before they reached the creek crossing. He didn't notice at first. Then he glanced over and saw her head tilted slightly against the seat back, her hands loose in her lap, the notebook she'd been holding sliding sideways at an angle that would have bothered her if she'd been awake. She had not slept more than 4 hours a night in the last 2 weeks. He knew this because the lamp in the kitchen had been visible under his bedroom door at 1 and 2 and sometimes 3 in the morning, and he had not said anything about it because saying something about it would have been the same as saying stop, and stopping was not something either of them could afford. He drove more carefully after that, avoided the worst of the ruts, took the creek crossing slower than usual. She woke up on the last ridge, the way people sometimes do when a vehicle slows. A slight sharpening, a breath. She looked out at the valley below, the crossbar visible in the late afternoon light, and she did not say anything for a moment. "You let me sleep," she said. "You needed it," he said. She straightened up and retrieved the notebook from where it had slid and set it on her lap with the automatic gesture of a person reassembling their working self. Then she stopped. She looked at the notebook. She put it on the seat between them instead of opening it. "Yes," she said. "I did." They drove the last stretch in silence. When he pulled up to the house and set the brake and climbed down, she was already on her side, stepping down without waiting. Old habit. He'd stopped commenting on it weeks ago. He'd stopped most of the things he'd told himself he would maintain. The careful distance, the practical tone, the deliberate limitation of everything to what was necessary and nothing beyond. It turned out necessity had a way of expanding. But the first thing Evelyn did when they got inside was put the kettle on. Not coffee, tea, which she made for herself when she was genuinely exhausted and which she had been making more often lately. Wyatt sat at the kitchen table and watched her move around the kitchen with the ease of someone who had learned the geography of a space and made it her own without announcing the moment it happened. He thought about the first morning she'd been here, the coffee already made, her standing at the window, watching the east pasture. Cattle were restless last night. He'd been slightly annoyed by it, he remembered, the presumption of it, the way she had simply been present and observant in a space he'd had to himself for 7 years. He'd called it annoyance. He understood now it had been something else, something that felt like annoyance from the inside because it was easier to manage than the alternative. "The criminal investigation will take months," she said, setting the kettle on. "Victor won't be arrested tomorrow morning. That's not how it works." "I know," he said. "He still has resources. He'll have lawyers working on every angle of the charges." She turned and leaned against the counter. "There will be moments where it looks like things are going his direction. That's the nature of a long investigation. I want you to be prepared for that." "Are you telling me this because you think I'll panic?" he said, "or because you tell yourself this and it helps?" She looked at him for a moment. Then the corner of her mouth moved in the way it did when something caught her off guard, but she didn't want to make too much of it. "Both," she said. The kettle began to build toward boiling. Outside, the evening was coming in the way Montana evenings came in September, fast, with a cold edge that the afternoon hadn't warned you about. Wyatt could hear the cattle in the east pasture, settled and indifferent to human proceedings, which he found steadying. "The boundary restoration will be filed with the county clerk within 2 weeks," Evelyn said. "I'll handle that documentation. The water rights revert automatically once the amendments are voided. I want to confirm that with the commission in writing, just to have the record clean." She paused. "Ray Faskin's situation is more complicated. He already sold the parcels. The fraud voiding doesn't automatically undo a private land sale." Wyatt looked up. "Is there anything to do for Ray?" "There's a civil damages claim possible against the Langford Land Trust. If the sale can be shown to have been forced by the fraudulent water access removal, and it can, given the timeline, Ray may be able to recover damages even if the land itself is gone." She turned back to the kettle. "I want to write to Edmund Farr about it. He's not a practicing attorney, but he knows people." "You do that?" Wyatt said. "For Ray." She poured the water into the cup without looking at him. "I do it because it's the right thing to do," she said. "And because Ray Faskin sat on that bench outside the hearing room turning his hat in his hands for 40 minutes, and he did it without complaining. And that kind of man deserves better than losing his father's land to a criminal scheme and having the only outcome be that the scheme is stopped." She set the kettle down. "He should get something back. Whatever can be gotten." Wyatt looked at the table. He had known, since the kettle and the east pasture window on the second morning, That Evelyn Hale was not a woman who did things without reason. But the reasons kept turning out to be larger than they appeared on the surface, and he kept finding this out at unexpected moments. And each time it happened, it was the same. A sensation like a floor that turns out to be more solid than you'd trusted it to be. And the surprise of that solidity, and the small shame of having doubted it. "Evelyn," he said. She turned. He had thought about how to say this for approximately 3 weeks, and had not found the right arrangement of words, which was unusual for him because he was not a man who typically struggled with saying things plainly. The struggle was not about plainness. It was about the fact that saying it plainly meant saying it in a way that could not be walked back. And he had spent 7 years building a life in which nothing he said could be walked back, because he hadn't said anything that mattered. He understood now that this was not a sustainable arrangement. "I wrote you a letter 6 months ago," he said, "that described a business arrangement, a practical partnership. I was deliberate about it. I was specific." He looked at his hands on the table. "I want you to know that I understood exactly what I was describing. I wasn't confused about it. I wasn't hoping for something different without admitting it." He looked up at her. "I'm telling you this because I want to be honest about where I started, so that what I'm saying now means what I intend it to mean." She was very still. She had her cup in both hands, and she was watching him with the attention she gave things that mattered, the full compass kind. "I'm not looking for a practical arrangement anymore," he said. "I haven't been for a while. I don't know exactly when it changed. I think it might have been the first morning. The coffee and the pasture. I think I knew then and told myself something else." He stopped. "You don't have to say anything about it right now. I'm not asking you for a response tonight. I just needed to say it plainly because I've been not saying it for weeks, and the not saying it was starting to feel dishonest. And you've been honest with me from the first day, and I owe you the same." The kitchen was very quiet. Evelyn set her cup down on the counter. She looked at it for a moment, not avoiding him, just pausing in the specific way she paused when she was deciding something and wanted to decide it correctly rather than quickly. "The second morning," she said, "not the first." He looked at her. "You came down to the kitchen and you didn't tell me to stay out of the east pasture," she said. "You said fine, and you got your coffee, and you didn't ask me to justify being up before you or knowing about the cattle or any of it. You just said fine." She looked at him directly. "I had been in situations before where men said fine and meant something else entirely." "You meant fine." She paused. "I noticed that." He was quiet. "I'm not an easy person to be with," she said. "I want to be clear about that before anything else. I have opinions, and I act on them before I've always thought through how they land. I run ahead of conversations, and I don't always report back. I'm aware of this. I don't always manage to correct it in the moment." She looked at him steadily. "And I spent 11 years being the person who held everything together for everyone else. And I came out of that not entirely sure what I'm like when I'm not holding something together. I'm still finding that out." "You've been holding something together since you got here," he said. "That's different," she said. "That was necessary. I mean, when it isn't necessary. When things are—" She paused. She looked for the word. "Ordinary." "I'd like to find out with you," he said, "what ordinary looks like." She looked at him for a long moment. The September dark was fully down now outside the kitchen window, and the lamp on the table threw its familiar light across the familiar room. And somewhere in the east pasture the cattle were settled, and the tributary was running where it was always supposed to run, and the iron bars at the fence post were still in the ground where his father had put them 60 years ago. "All right," she said. It was not a grand declaration. It was not a performance. It was exactly what it was. Two people, neither of them simple, neither of them without damage, deciding to try something that neither of them had managed to believe in for a considerable time. He reached across the table, and she came and sat across from him, and they drank their respective drinks, her tea, his coffee, in a silence that was the most comfortable silence he had known in 7 years, which told him everything he needed to know about the decision they had just made. They were married on the last Saturday of October, in the front room of the Crossbar Ranch, with Chester Pruitt as witness and May Keller as the second, because Evelyn had said she wanted someone there who had fought for something, and May had looked briefly startled and then straightened up in a way that said she understood exactly what was being offered. It was not a large event. It was not meant to be. The justice of the peace from Millbrook came out in his good coat and read the words that were required, and Wyatt and Evelyn said what they were supposed to say. and meant it, which is all those words have ever needed. Afterward, May brought a cake she had made without being asked, which caused Chester to eat 3 pieces and remark that she had hidden depths, which caused May to tell him that her depths were none of his business, which caused Gerald Keller to laugh so hard he had to put down his plate. Wyatt watched all of this from where he was standing with Evelyn, just slightly apart from the group the way they both naturally stood, close to things, but not quite in the middle of them, and he thought that the specific gathering of people in his front room was the most alive his house had felt since the last time Clara had filled it with her particular quality of warmth, and that thinking this did not feel like a betrayal of anything, but instead like a conversation between the life he'd had and the one he was beginning, and that both of them were real and both of them mattered, and they could exist in the same room without one canceling the other. He had not expected to understand that. He was glad he did. Evelyn looked up at him. She had seen his expression shift, and she read it, the way she read most things, accurately. "You all right?" she said. "Yeah," he said. "I'm all right." She nodded once, the satisfied nod of a person who has confirmed a fact, and went back to watching Chester attempt to negotiate a 4th piece of cake with May, who was not negotiating. 3 things happened in November that changed the shape of the valley. The first was that the Territorial Attorney General filed formal charges against Victor Langford, Harlan Bright, and a man named Pressler, 11 counts between them, ranging from survey fraud to public corruption to bank manipulation. Victor's lawyers responded immediately and extensively, and the legal proceedings would take the better part of 2 years to resolve, as Evelyn had predicted they would. But the charges were filed and they were serious, and the land trust accounts were frozen pending investigation, which meant Victor's operational capacity in the valley was effectively over, regardless of the courtroom outcome. The second was that Ray Faskin received a letter from a civil attorney in Helena, a man Evelyn had written to, connected through Edmund Farr, informing him that a damages claim against the Langford Land Trust had been filed on his behalf at no initial cost, and that the preliminary review of the case was promising. Ray came to the crossbar to tell them this in person. He stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands, the same way he'd sat outside the hearing room, and he said, "I don't know what to say to you people," which was more than enough. Evelyn said, "Come in and have coffee, Ray." He did. The third thing was that Dunmore family got their water access back. The boundary restoration, filed and processed in 2 weeks as Evelyn had said it would be, returned the tributary access to its original legal position on the crossbar, and on the 3 adjoining properties whose amendments had been tied to the same survey filing sequence. The Dunmores discovered this on a cold November morning when they rode the north fence line and found the creek running through land that was theirs again, which was not dramatic in itself. Creeks don't care about legal proceedings, but which meant that next spring's grass on the east slope would have water, and the spring after that, and the one after that. Margaret Dunmore told Evelyn about it at the general store in Harlow Creek on a Tuesday afternoon. She told it plainly, without embellishment, because she was that kind of woman. Then she said, "I don't know how you did what you did, but I'm glad somebody did it." Evelyn said, "I had a lot of help." "I know you did," Margaret said, "but it needed someone who could see the whole of it. Not everyone can see the whole of something that big." Evelyn looked at the counter for a moment. She was not comfortable with this kind of thing, being thanked directly, having her work named by someone looking her in the face. Wyatt had observed this and found it endearing in the way that only genuine qualities are endearing, the ones that are not performed but simply present. "I saw it because I had access to the records," Evelyn said. "You saw it because you looked," Margaret said. "There's a difference." The room they opened in December was Thomas's room. It had been closed since Wyatt had put the bed and the chest of drawers in it for Evelyn's arrival, and after Evelyn had moved her things to the larger room off the main hallway, the week after their marriage, without ceremony, because the small room made more sense as something else. The door had been standing shut again. Not locked, just shut, the way rooms shut when nobody is using them and nobody has decided what they should become. Evelyn raised the subject on a Sunday evening when the first real snow of the season was coming down outside, soft and indifferent, covering the fence lines and the water trough and the iron bars at the gatepost under an even white that made everything look simpler than it was. "I want to talk about the back room," she said. Wyatt set down the book he hadn't been reading. All right. I know what it was, she said. She said it directly, the way she said things that required directness and would be made worse by gentleness. And I know it's been shut. And I'm not going to tell you what it should be now, because that's not my decision. She looked at him. But I want you to know that I don't think it should stay shut. Not because of me. I'm not asking for a room, because a shut room in a house is a weight, and I think you've been carrying enough weight. He looked at the fire for a while. I don't know what to do with it, he said. I've thought about it. I can't. He stopped. I put a bed in there for you because I had to put something in there, and it was easier when there was something practical in it, when it became a room with a purpose. Then give it a purpose, she said. What kind of purpose? She was quiet for a moment. There are settlers coming through every year who need legal help and can't afford Helena. The Land Commission fraud exposed that. People who own land and don't know their rights and are therefore vulnerable to anyone who does know and doesn't have their interests at heart. She looked at him. I've been writing letters, answering questions. Chester has been sending people to me. She paused. I could do it properly. A room set up for it? A desk? The filing system I've already half built anyway. Something that has a function. He looked at her. You want to practice law, he said. I want to do the work, she said carefully. I can't practice law. I'm not admitted to the territorial bar. A pause. But I can help people understand what their documents say and what their rights are, and how to find the right person to file what needs to be filed. I've been doing it informally since November. I'd like to do it properly. In Thomas's room, he said. She didn't look away. It would still be his room. That doesn't go away because there's a desk in it. She said this quietly, without qualifying it or softening the edges. The people you love don't take up less space when you do something with the room they were in. They take up the same space. It just gets used. He sat with that for a long time. The fire went through its middle phase, settling from the bright part into the steady working heat that would last the night. All right, he said finally. They opened the room on a Sunday morning. Wyatt carried the desk in from the storage room. It had been his father's, solid oak, heavier than it looked, with a drawer that stuck unless you knew to lift it slightly before pulling. Evelyn carried the filing boxes she had been keeping in the kitchen corner. They arranged things without much discussion, the way they worked best, each of them understanding the shape of the task and moving through it. When they were done, they stood in the doorway and looked at the room. It was a working room. There was a desk and a lamp and 3 shelves of organized documents and a chair that was not comfortable but was practical, which was appropriate. There was also, on the narrow shelf above the window, the photograph of a 9-year-old boy sitting on a fence rail with his arms out and his face terrified and delighted, which Wyatt had brought from the mantel that morning without discussing it first. Evelyn saw it. She looked at it for a moment. Thank you, she said. He would have liked that there was work being done, Wyatt said. He was a restless kid. Couldn't stand for things to be idle. Evelyn looked at the photograph a moment longer. He looks like he was a handful, she said. The worst kind, Wyatt said. The kind you can't stay angry at. She smiled. The real one. The one she didn't manage at all. The one that arrived without her arranging it and showed something behind the practical surface that was unguarded and genuine and worth any amount of patience to see. Winter on the crossbar had a specific character that spring and summer didn't prepare you for. It was long and quiet in a way that compressed everything. The days shorter, the work concentrated, the ranch turned inward on itself, the valley visible from the ridge as a white expanse with dark marks where the ranches were, smoke rising from chimneys in the still cold air. Wyatt had always endured winter more than lived it. He'd gotten through the days and waited for March. This winter was different. The house had a different quality. Not louder, Evelyn was not a loud person, but fuller, in the way a room is fuller when there is a fire in the hearth compared to when there isn't, even if the room is the same size. People came to the back room, not constantly. Evelyn had a schedule, Tuesdays and Thursdays, and by appointment otherwise, and she was firm about the structure of it because she had seen what happened to people who worked without structure. Chester sent the first 3. 2 of them were dealing with the aftermath of the Langford fraud, boundary questions, document restoration, questions about what the commission ruling meant for their specific situations. One was a woman named Addie Strome, whose late husband had left her a deed with a clouded title and who had been told by 3 different men that there was nothing to be done about it, which turned out to be false. Addie Strome's title was cleared by February. She brought a jar of preserved apricots to the crossbar in thanks, which Wyatt ate approximately half of before Evelyn pointed out she had also been planning to eat them. "You didn't say anything," he said. "I was going to have them with breakfast," she said. "You should have said something." I shouldn't have needed to," she said, but she wasn't actually angry and he knew the difference now. He bought her apricots from the general store the following week. She said nothing about this, but the jar disappeared from the pantry at a rate that suggested they had been well received. These were the ordinary things. The ones she had said she didn't know herself in yet. He watched her find them. The apricots and the Tuesday schedule and the particular way she made coffee on mornings when she had a lot of thinking to do, standing at the window with the cup until it went cold. The way she read in the evenings, sitting in the second chair on the porch, even when it was cold enough to need a blanket, because she preferred the outside air and had decided that a blanket was a reasonable solution to this preference. The way she was with the cattle, unsentimental but not unkind, efficient and attentive, the way you are with things that depend on you and that you have taken seriously. He watched her find herself in ordinary life, and he found, doing this, that ordinary life had become interesting again. Not exciting in any dramatic sense, interesting the way a good piece of land is interesting, the way it keeps showing you things you didn't know were there. He had not expected to find that again. He had not been looking for it. That was probably why it arrived. In March, Edmund Farr wrote to say that his testimony had been formally entered into the Attorney General's expanded case file, and that 2 additional surveyors had been identified as part of a broader fraud network that extended beyond the Yellowstone Valley into 3 adjacent counties. The scope of what Evelyn had uncovered, Farr wrote, was larger than anyone had understood when she filed. She read the letter at the kitchen table on a Wednesday morning and then set it down and looked out the window at the east pasture, where the first real thaw was beginning and the cattle were moving differently. The loose, exploratory movement of animals that have been cold for months and can feel the change coming. "It's bigger than I thought," she said. "Does that surprise you?" Wyatt asked. She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "I knew there was more. I just didn't know how much more." She picked up her coffee cup. "Farr says there's a territorial bar inquiry underway now into the Helena attorneys involved. If that proceeds, there may be grounds for additional civil claims by affected landowners." "That's good," Wyatt said. "It means more work," she said. "Not complaining, noting." "Is that a problem?" She looked at him. "No," she said. "It's not a problem." She looked back at the window. "I want to write to the commission about formalizing some kind of advocate process for small landholders, a way for people without legal resources to access the kind of help they need without depending on someone accidentally happening to be in the right place with the right background." She turned the cup in her hands. "It shouldn't be accidental. It should be structural." Wyatt looked at her across the table. "Write the letter," he said. "It might not go anywhere," she said. "Write it anyway," he said. "Things that matter usually need to be said more than once before anyone does anything about them." She looked at him for a moment with the expression that he had come to understand meant she was registering something but not making a production of it. "All right," she said, and picked up her pencil. Victor Langford was formally convicted of survey fraud and public corruption 18 months after the Millbrook hearing. His attorneys managed to reduce several charges, and the proceeding was long and at moments appeared to be moving in his direction, which was exactly what Evelyn had warned Wyatt would happen, and which Wyatt, having been warned, was able to watch without losing his footing. Harlan Bright resigned from the county commission before the charges reached trial and left the territory entirely. Pressler cooperated with the Attorney General and received a reduced sentence, which Evelyn said was appropriate, given the cooperation, and which Wyatt thought was probably right, which was the kind of measured judgment about justice that he suspected he had learned partly from watching her. Caleb Pruitt, C.P. Rudd, was sentenced to 2 years. He served 14 months. Evelyn's formal statement to the sentencing judge, submitted in writing, noted his cooperation and the complete accuracy of his testimony, and asked the court to consider the fact that he had been a young man in financial difficulty when Victor Langford had first approached him, and that a person's worst decision, made under pressure and compounded by fear, is not the whole of them. The judge read the statement into the record. Wyatt read it afterward and did not say anything because there was nothing to add. The Dunmores held on to their land. So did the Kellers. Ray Faskin's civil damages claim settled for an amount Chester described as decent, which in Chester's vocabulary meant genuinely significant. Ray bought a small parcel on the Eastern Fork, not the original land that was gone, and started over at 61 years old, which most people would have said was too late, and which Ray apparently did not agree with. Wyatt went to see him the spring after the settlement. Ray was putting in fence posts on his new parcel, working steadily in the good Montana morning. He looked up when Wyatt rode over. "How's it going?" Wyatt said. Ray drove another post. "Slow," he said, "but going." Wyatt sat on his horse and watched him for a moment. "Evelyn's talking about expanding the advocate work," he said, "into adjacent counties, FAR's connecting her with people. She's building something." Ray straightened up and squinted at him. "What do you think about that?" Wyatt looked at the mountains to the west, white-capped still in April, and at the valley between them and the mountains, green now with the spring, the creek threading through it where it was always supposed to run. "I think she's exactly what she is," he said. "And what she is someone who sees the whole of something and does something about it." He looked back at Ray. "I think the valley is better for it. I think I'm better for it." Ray nodded once, slow and certain, the way men of his age and experience nodded when something was simply true. "She going to be all right out here?" Ray said. "Long term. It's hard country." "She patched a water trough her second week on the ranch," Wyatt said. "She was up before me to check on sick cattle. She built a fraud case in 3 weeks that the Attorney General is still working through." He paused. "She's not just going to be all right. She's going to change what all right means." But Ray laughed, short and genuine, the way men laugh when something has caught them off guard and they're glad it did. "Tell her I said so," he said. "Tell her yourself," Wyatt said. "She'll be at the Tuesday session." On a Thursday evening in June, Wyatt came in from the north fence, the boundary that was his again, clean and documented, the tributary running through it as it had run through his father's land and his grandfather's land before it, and found Evelyn on the porch with a letter in her hand. Not working, just sitting, which was still unusual enough that he noticed it. He came up the steps and sat in the other chair. "What is it?" he said. She handed him the letter. It was from the Territorial Commission, a formal letter signed by Horace Devlin, informing her that the commission had voted to create a new position, Advocate Liaison for Frontier Landholders, and was formally requesting that she apply for the inaugural appointment, which would allow her to represent the interests of small landholders before the commission without bar admission, under a newly drafted charter provision that the commission was submitting to the territorial legislature for ratification. He read it twice. "Devlin created this for you," he said. "For the need," she said. "I'm the most qualified person he knows to fill it, which is not the same thing." "It's also the same thing," he said. She was quiet. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I'm thinking it's a lot," she said. "I'm thinking that 6 months ago I was on a stagecoach from Columbus with one bag and a practical arrangement and no idea what this place looked like." She looked out at the valley. "I'm thinking I didn't come here for any of this. I came because it was the next thing to do after 11 years of the previous things, and I didn't know what I was coming to." He looked at the valley alongside her. The June evening was long and soft. The light still high at 7 o'clock. The grass in the east pasture a green that didn't exist anywhere except after a wet spring in Montana, and the cattle were moving slowly toward the water trough that held without leaking, and the iron bars at the gatepost were catching the last of the sun the way they caught it every evening. "Are you glad you came?" he said. She turned and looked at him, directly, the full compass kind, the look that didn't look away. "Yes," she said. He took her hand. She let him, the way she had in the hallway outside the hearing room, without ceremony, without making it more or less than it was, which was simply two people who had arrived at each other by unlikely and imperfect routes, and had decided, each of them privately and then together, that unlikely and imperfect was more than enough. "Apply for the position," he said. She looked at the letter again. "It's a lot of work," she said. "On top of the Tuesdays and Thursdays and the ranch." "I know," he said. "I'll need to hire someone to help with the filing." "All right." "Chester will complain that I'm away too much." "Chester complains about everything and means none of it," he said. She almost smiled. "I'll need my own horse. Your brown mare is not suitable for the kind of distances this would require." "I know a man who breeds solid working horses outside Billings," he said. "I'll write to him." She looked at him. "You've already decided," she said. "I decided when I read Devlin's letter," he said. It took about 4 seconds. "You could have said so." "I wanted to hear your reasons first," he said, "to make sure they were the right ones." She looked at him with the expression she reserved for moments when he had said something she hadn't expected but that fit. A recognition, the way you recognize a place you've never been, but somehow know. "They were the right ones," she said. "I know," he said. She looked back at the valley. He looked at it with her. Somewhere down the ridge, the Keller place was visible as a dark shape against the grass, and further east, barely distinguishable, the Dunmore fence line ran along the north tributary where the water was running and would run next year and the year after. Ray Faskin's new parcel was not visible from here, but Wyatt knew the direction of it, and looked that way anyway, at the mountains and the deep blue sky above them, and the country that was hard and unforgiving, and also, on evenings like this, as close to beautiful as anything he had been given the eyes to see. People talked about the frontier as though it was a thing to be conquered. He had always known better. The frontier was a thing to be understood. Its terms, its requirements, its specific and unromantic demands. You either learned them or you didn't last. What Evelyn had taught him, without intending to teach him anything, without presenting herself as instruction, was that the same was true of the other frontier, the one inside a person, the one you built walls around after enough loss, telling yourself the walls were practical, telling yourself that fortification was wisdom. That frontier too had terms and requirements, and the requirement was not to be conquered. It was to be understood, to be entered into honestly, with the specific courage of someone who has already been hurt and goes back in anyway because the alternative is living inside a wall until you die in it. He understood this now. He understood it because of a woman who had arrived on a stagecoach with one bag and seen a sick heifer before anyone else had noticed, and patched a water trough with a method he didn't know, and built a fraud case in the kitchen by lamplight, and opened a room that had been shut, and written letters on behalf of a man she didn't know because it was the right thing to do. She was not a perfect person. She ran ahead of conversations. She forgot to share what she was working on until the work was half done. She let her coffee go cold because she forgot to drink it. She was sometimes so inside a problem that the rest of the world waited. He was not a perfect person. He had spent 7 years behind a wall he called practicality. He held things in past the point where holding made sense. He was better with cattle than with words, except on the days when the words arrived more clearly than he expected. And even then, he usually got them out wrong the first time. They were, in other words, two ordinary people living an ordinary life on a working Montana ranch, and the ordinary was exactly enough. The evening came down slowly over the crossbar. The cattle settled. The creek ran where it was always supposed to run. The photograph of a 9-year-old boy sat on a shelf in a room where work was being done, and the iron bars at the gatepost stood in the ground where they had always been, and in 2 chairs on the porch of a house that was no longer just standing but actually genuinely lived in, 2 people who had come to each other by imperfect and unlikely means sat with their hands together in the long June light and watched the valley they were part of breathe. That was all. That was everything. Some things do not resolve so much as they deepen. Some beginnings do not announce themselves but arrive quietly, in the middle of ordinary things, and are only understood as beginnings later, when you look back and see the exact moment the direction changed. For Wyatt Mercer, that moment was a woman stepping off a stage with one bag, looking at the street, and walking toward him without hesitation. For Evelyn Hale, it was a man who said fine and meant it. The rest was just life. The good, hard, honest, imperfect, irreplaceable rest of it.